very much. We're going to pass immediately to the next panel, and Robert Picard was kind enough to agree to sit in the next panel, so he's going to answer questions along with the panelists in a few minutes. So I would like to invite Vin and Gary to come, and Lorraine is going to chair this panel now. We don't have the person from the Daily Telegraph that is in the program. She was not able to come, unfortunately. So, this will fit well because this panel is a very good segue for what has been talking now. So it's going to be a sort of a continuation. So stay where you are and enjoy the panel.
In the interest of time, we are going to go ahead and get started. I won't give a long introduction to our panelists. You've already heard the introduction for Dr. Picard. The introduction for our other two panelists, Gary Mayo and Vin, how do you pronounce your name? Vin Crosby is in the book. But I did want to say that Gary's Senior Vice President for Print and Internet Sales for Scarborough Media. And Vin, whose bio I had read earlier and didn't read again, is the managing partner of Digital Deliverance of Greenwich. And it's a firm that advises the news industry about online businesses. And I think this will be an interesting follow to the discussion that Dr. Picard started about what's happening with the bottom line of newspapers in particular and online journalism. So what we'll do is we'll have each of our panelists start off by giving a brief presentation of their thoughts about the future of online journalism and this new business model and how are we going to make money online. And then we can start asking some questions. And I think we'll start with Gary, and then we'll follow up.
How do I get my presentation up? See that? Friday presentation. There I am. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for having me, number one. I found Dr. Picard's presentation quite fascinating. Earlier this week, I attended the Newspaper Association of America's annual convention in Chicago, which is primarily made up of the publishers of the major newspapers around the United States. And my wife, who also worked for a few years in the newspaper business, we were talking on the phone one night, and she said, "What's your impression of the conference?" And I said, "It's a bunch of old white guys in complete denial." And I think that's basically what we heard this morning. What I'm going to talk about a little bit is what we do at Scarborough is measure the audiences of newspapers and their websites. And so I'm going to focus primarily on the audience. Dr. Picard said that the audience is basically the primary underlying component of the newspaper business model, and so that's why I'm going to kind of focus on that. So my agenda is just tell you quickly about Scarborough and what we do. We'll look at the readership trends in printed newspapers, and then we'll look at the newspaper website audience in terms of size and composition, talk a little bit about newspaper economics and how these changes in audiences are affecting the economics, and then I'm just going to pose a couple of ideas that you all might want to think about as the symposium progresses. At Scarborough, what we do is a local market syndicated study. So we're in 80 markets around the country, and we measure consumer behavior, retail behavior, media usage, demographics, et cetera. But we are essentially the rating service for the newspaper industry. So in the way Nielsen is for TV, Arbitron is for radio, Scarborough is for newspapers. And we utilize a two-phase methodology in our data collection. We call people up on the phone and ask them about their media usage, and we mail them a product booklet where we collect other information. And just about every major metropolitan daily newspaper in the markets that we measure is a subscriber to our service, as well as the advertising agencies and advertisers who place advertising in newspapers. This is an old story, okay? This is the average issue newspaper readership trend over the last few years. When I say it's an old story, it's old because we all know that newspaper audiences are eroding, but it's old because it is an old story. Newspaper audiences have been eroding since the early 60s, and it has been exacerbated somewhat in recent years as a result of the Internet. And as Dr. Picard pointed out, there's also this generational gap where as people got older, they tended to pick up the newspaper as they got more rooted in their communities and were interested in what the school board was doing and those sorts of things. They became newspaper readers. But today that dynamic is not happening to the same degree because younger people are used to getting their news from digital means. Just a point about readership. Readership and circulation are not the same things, and I just wanted to point this out because I often see these terms used interchangeably in the trades, and they're really not the same thing. Circulation is the number of newspapers sold, so it's actual numbers of newspapers sold that the newspapers count, and then an organization called the Audit Bureau of Circulations audits those counts and says, yes, this is the circulation of a newspaper. And circulation was very much in the news in the summer of 2004, where a lot of prominent newspapers were caught basically cheating on their ABC statements, and that became a big news item. Readership, however, are the number of adults who read the paper. So when we're talking about readership, we're talking about people. With circulation, we're talking about papers. And readership is measured with survey research, and that's what we do at Scarborough. So I just wanted to make that distinction clear because I so often see these terms used interchangeably in the media, in the newspapers even. So just a point about newspapers. I mean, newspapers in a lot of ways have pioneered the digital news industry, if you will. One of the earliest news websites was the San Jose Mercury News' website, Mercury Center. So newspapers have been at this for quite a long time. And there have been success stories, but there are still a lot of problems and challenges, as we've heard about. This data is from November of 2005. I'm sorry it's not newer. Nielsen Net Ratings is very protective of their information. If anybody out there has newer information, I'd be happy to hear you say it. But basically, in November of 2005, newspaper websites reached an all-time high in terms of audience of 55 million users. Okay, that's a huge amount of people. That's a 30% increase over the previous year. In November of 2005, almost a third of all active Internet users visited newspaper websites, almost a third. Unique visitors to newspaper websites jumped 21% from January of 2005 to December of 2005, and page views increased by 43% over that same time period. And 11 of the top 25 national news and information websites are newspaper websites. And this is all from Nielsen Net Ratings. Now, what newspapers like to do or like to talk about is the amount of audience, additional audience that they get because of their websites. We know that regular print audiences are eroding, but their online audiences are growing. So they're making a big push to put these audiences together to be able to tell advertisers, we're not actually losing audience, we're actually gaining audience. And some of you may have noticed that the Newspaper Association of America put out a press release earlier this week basically touting this very fact. And this is some data from the Houston Chronicle where basically, their daily paper over the course of a week reaches about 47% of the adults in the Houston DMA. But when you factor in their website, they get another 8% of reach of the marketplace. So they're actually reaching 55% between the print and online products. And on Sunday, you see a similar kind of pattern because there are some people who are just reading the paper online. And so they're picking up an additional audience, not only an audience that's duplicated. Now, I do want to make the point that for most newspaper websites that we look at, the audience is primarily duplicated. In other words, the people that are going to the website are also reading the paper in print. So there is not a huge amount of new readers that were not reading the paper at all. Though we're starting to see a fair amount of migration of people who were reading it in print and now are just reading it exclusively online. These audiences are sizable if you compare them to other media. For example, if Chron.com, which is the Houston Chronicle's website, was a radio station, its weekly audience would be the #1 radio station in the market. This is showing the weekly drive time audiences of the top 5 radio stations in Houston compared to the weekly audience of Chron.com, and these are percentages, percent coverage of adults. So if Chron.com was a radio station, it would be the #1 radio station in the market. Does it get the revenue that the #1 radio station in the market gets? No. Another important point about the audiences of newspaper websites is that they tend to be younger than the audience of the printed website, though, or the printed newspaper, excuse me, though they are just as upscale and in some ways more so. So as Dr. Picard talked about, the newspaper audience, the printed audience, as it's getting smaller, it's getting older, and these people tend to be more upscale, better educated, higher income, better employed, for example. But if you look at the newspaper website demographically, they're just as upscale, but they're younger. And what I'm using here are indexes where 100 is the average, and when you index over 100, you're doing better for that group. If you index below 100, you're not doing as well. So you can see the indexes for the upscale demographics are very high for both audiences, but the age indexes are exactly the opposite. Okay? So this is something that newspapers are touting among the advertising community, and they're saying, well, everybody thinks we don't reach young people anymore, when in fact we are reaching young people with our websites. And with audience comes revenue. As we heard, the audience is the underlying component of the business model, so as the audience moves online, revenue online is increasing. Advertising revenue for general market newspaper websites is expected to reach $2.5 billion this year. And newspaper website revenue will comprise 5% of total newspaper revenue this year. Now, it's, again, not a big number in terms of the percentage of the overall revenue pie, but it's growing. That's the point. And it's growing because newspaper websites reach affluent, upscale, and young audiences. And this information is from the Newspaper Association of America. All right, let's just talk about newspaper revenue by type for a second. At your typical newspaper, about 81% of their revenue comes from advertising, and about 19% of their revenue comes from circulation, or 20% so. So let's say, for example, in this brave new world where people are no longer reading the print edition, but they're going online, if the online site is not a paid model, like, say, the Wall Street Journal, for example, then that circulation revenue goes away. So if you're putting your content up there for free and you're not charging for it, then there is no circulation revenue. And very few papers are willing to charge. As a matter of fact, papers are starting to move away from having their users register because they want to put more emphasis on traffic and less emphasis on trying to get demographic information about their users. So that's a big problem, obviously. And when you look at just advertising revenue, this is the way it kind of breaks down. About 17, the smallest category is national. At smaller newspapers, that category would actually be much smaller than 17%. But in general, it's about 17% of the total advertising pie. National advertising are things that come from national advertisers, like airlines, for example. 46% comes from retail. That's the